Raccoon City is one of the most iconic zombie outbreaks ever told. We see Raccoon City get destroyed in an attempt to stop the T-virus in its tracks. But would this work, or would it just slow down the inevitable fall of humanity? That's what today's video is about. We're gonna do a full breakdown of what would actually happen based on real-world science and what we know about the T-virus, of whether or not humanity could survive a Raccoon City-style outbreak. Let's get into it. The two major things we need to ask in order to be able to understand this question is 1, how does the T-virus spread? And 2, would the thermobaric bomb be able to effectively eliminate each of these pathways that the virus has? First, we know that the T-virus can spread through bodily fluids, or getting bitten. So, if every single zombie was in fact effectively eliminated during the detonation of that bomb in Raccoon City, we can say that this mode of transport for the virus is eliminated. However, specific to the games, I have some beef with Arclay Forest. I would argue that Arclay Forest has plenty of infected left, and I'd be surprised if we don't see the aftermath of this in Resident Evil 9. There are almost guaranteed zombies, dogs, leeches, infected plant life, and other forms of carriers that got contaminated by other zombies, because we see between Resident Evil 0 and 1 plenty of zombies that are outside, and it's not like these compounds had a fence around them to prevent them from escaping, and the explosions were big enough to take them all out. They could have just walked away. As a matter of fact, that's literally how Resident Evil 1 gets started, with the rumors of people eating others from Arclay Forest. But if all zombies are in fact eliminated by a thermobaric detonation, then it's safe to say that this method of transferring the virus is eliminated. Our second method of spread for the virus is when it's airborne. This is not confirmed, but is alluded to as to why there was an outbreak in the Spencer Mansion in the first place. In the document, The Keeper's Diary, we read his descent into succumbing to the T-virus, but there's some important takeaways from this particular file. We know that some kind of an emergency leak happened and everybody had to start wearing hazmat suits during their work at the mansion. However, he was already infected. We know he didn't get bitten because everyone else that got bitten writes about it. That bastard bit me. So what exactly happened? So our options are either it was airborne or it was contaminated water, like with what happens in Raccoon City. However, if it was as simple as just contaminated water, they would have had their employees drinking sterilized water from a can, and the hazmat suit really wouldn't be able to prevent that. So the only thing that makes sense that has these guys contaminated, even after putting a hazmat suit on, and that they weren't being given any kind of sterile rations, means it was an airborne leak. Now I know what you're thinking. Two major things. 1, the STARS members go to the mansion and they don't get infected from breathing the air, and we also don't see any of the survivors from Raccoon City get infected from an airborne virus either. That's because this was likely an experimental and unstable version of the T-virus that was being used in an airborne delivery method, but was deemed ineffective, 1, because of its lack of control, and 2, because it had a short half-life, leading to the STARS member being able to safely breathe the air in the mansion just a few days after it leaked. The good news is, in our real-world scenario, if there was an airborne version of the T-virus that got out or into a city, a thermobaric bomb, due to how they work in superheating the environment, they would effectively knock out any airborne pathogens, and this method of transfer would also be eliminated. Now, the third method of infection is injection. We know through gameplay and various files that in Umbrella's experiments, they transferred the virus into test subjects directly, either through IV into the bloodstream or intramuscular injection. However, it doesn't really matter, because when it comes to the terms of a citywide outbreak in a real-world scenario, this method of delivery isn't going to be something that's causing the outbreak in the first place, and would be pretty easy to eliminate. The fourth and final method of spread, which is also the deadliest and most difficult to manage, is ingestion. We know already that the outbreak happened because the citizens were drinking contaminated water. We also know that dogs and birds can become infected from eating infected flesh from another zombie. So, in the Raccoon City and real-world scenarios, even if every zombie is effectively sterilized in the detonation of a thermobaric bomb, we still have to ask the question, is the water safe? Well, let's take a look at how water works. We know that the T-virus is water stable. Again, that's how the Raccoon City outbreak happened in the first place. During the outbreak, there was also a lot of rain, and what else was there? Plenty of T-virus infected blood from all the slaughtered zombies running through the streets. We already know that ingestion and bodily fluids can spread the virus, so the blood would become diluted by the water and run off, causing that infected water to penetrate deep into the water table underneath the city. The outbreak itself lasted for multiple days, allowing that infected water to penetrate as deep as 30 feet or even deeper into the water table. The thermobaric bomb could have completely sterilized the city and all the surrounding air and areas, but it almost guaranteed did not sterilize the water underneath the city, and the T-virus would be alive and well. This is because thermobaric bombs are not designed to sterilize deep into the earth, let alone as deep as all the infected water would have gone over the course of multiple days. So, what happens next if there's still T-virus infected water in the water table underneath the city? Well, it starts small, but things would get out of hand rather quickly. First, small earth-dwelling bugs and plant life would become infected from the water underground. But this initial stage wouldn't last long, as the T-virus would quickly work its way up the food chain. Simple bugs and microorganisms would be consumed by larger bugs. Plants would absorb the water and become infected themselves, and we know what happened with Plant 42 and Plant 43 specimens. Imagine all the plants in and around a city becoming similarly infected. Birds and other creatures would eat the bugs and plants and become infected. They would in turn be consumed by other larger creatures, and those would become infected as well. Some of the birds and bugs would fly off to other habitats and spread the infection there, places like local forests or surrounding cities and towns. Once this begins, the virus would become completely uncontainable. They could destroy as many cities as they want at this point, and there is no going back. Groundwater everywhere would become completely infected by the bodily fluids of partially eaten and dead and decaying infected animals. At this point, T-virus infected biomes would start popping up everywhere. Infected plants, infected creatures, and eventually, infected people. But it gets much, much worse than that. At this point, humanity's only hope for survival would be to create completely isolated compounds while they let the entire world be consumed by the T-virus, because there is no stopping it. They would need to create compounds somewhere high to try and prevent groundwater contamination from being able to reach them, but they would also need to carefully cultivate and raise both their own livestock and crops and prevent those from becoming infected around the clock. Even if humanity got their hands on the information about the T-virus vaccine and managed to mass produce it and inoculate themselves so they can't become infected, they wouldn't be able to make it fast enough to be able to create vaccines for the crops or the livestock. And to make matters worse, trying to protect their livestock, vaccinated or not, from predators in surrounding areas that are infected by the T-virus is going to be almost impossible. But let's say humanity manages to pull this off. They create an isolated compound high enough to prevent water runnage from infecting their water supply. They vaccinate themselves, they vaccinate the livestock, and they manage to keep an inoculated strain of crops that they can use to grow for food. Would they still be able to make it? Let's work this out. Eventually, all wildlife, plants, animals, bugs, whatever, will become infected worldwide. Not only does this include local biomes like your local forest and parks, it also includes the oceans. And once everything's infected, they will no longer reproduce. That's because the virus drives the host to seek out new hosts to infect. They lose all desire for biological reproduction within the species. Once all the wildlife is infected and no longer reproducing, a series of domino effects begins to occur. First, food supply being gone because they only feed on uninfected other creatures so they can create a new host, they would eventually all starve to death, leaving a mass of decaying bodies from wild creatures who starved because of the infection all over the planet and in the oceans. There are also no longer any scavengers to clean them up, because infected creatures that were once a scavenger would not be looking to feed on decomposing material because it's a non-viable host once it's already dead. Pollinators will also eventually be gone, which means plants will no longer get pollinated, and creatures will no longer be reproducing. So eventually, entire ecosystems collapse all over the planet. Worldwide, all biological recycling that naturally occurs halts. Here, the planet experiences a mass extinction event, with the overwhelming majority of species on the planet, including the ocean, being completely wiped from existence. This would eventually lead to a slow, painful end for the remnants of humanity, even if they have themselves and their food sources protected from the virus. The entire Earth around them would collapse. So, to answer the question, in all reality, the outbreak of Raccoon City would not only actually be the end of humanity, it would be the end of all life on Earth.